Hello, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about what breaks down, why some suppliers consistently win in MSP programs, while others quietly stall or fade out, as we had alluded to in episode one, focusing on the common mistakes suppliers make and the operating disciplines required to perform well inside the channel. So, Kelly, I'm most excited to ask you a few questions to kind of help set the record straight here. What are the most common mistakes you see suppliers make inside the MSP programs that quietly hold them back or disqualify them over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for having me back. When I look at suppliers who are consistently winning in programs, the biggest difference isn't necessarily the sophistication, it's the strategy and it's discipline. The winners treat MSP as if it's a real channel, not a necessary evil. And that's a common thread in organizations that really truly want to partner. They decide early on that that channel matters, that the revenue opportunity is real, and they build an operating model and a rhythm around it that reflects that commitment. They're showing up consistently when volume dips and they don't wait for performance problems to force attention. So, losing suppliers, and that sounded rude, I don't necessarily mean it that way, but suppliers that struggle in these programs usually wait until the scorecard turns red before they panic and before they start to care, particularly if that's in a large customer that they have been working hard on and that their business is heavily dependent on. And as I've said before, by the time the scorecard comes out, that impact has already occurred, right? And so, um, the best suppliers are really assuming consistent commitment to that business. They are disciplined and they understand that that discipline itself is really the cost of entry into that volume MSP opportunity.
So I love that you talk about discipline because I find discipline should be the underlying message for everything that we're talking about, right? With any product, new service offering, you need to have that level of discipline. So I appreciate that. I would want to ask you, you often say MSP failure starts with mindset before it shows up in metrics like you were just alluded to. What does that look like in practice?
You hear it in the language. You hear your team frustration and complaining. Maybe there's even some blaming. You'll hear things like, it's just an MSP, it's just the VMS. We can only have a relationship with the inbox. There are no relationships, and relationships everywhere are critical. And oftentimes we forget about relationships with an MSP program team, and that's just really, really dangerous. And so, once your team starts to really believe that, then they stop showing up. Your account managers are going to disengage. They're going to stop really trying to meet quick submittal deadlines and looking at what the customer is truly looking for in those recs. Recruiters are going to stop putting their best candidates out, and just your presence overall drops. And so performance follows very, very quickly behind that. And as I've said before, by the time you see that red scorecard, the mindset's probably been broken for a long period of time. And so it starts at the top. Do we have a commitment to this channel? Do we want this to work? How are we communicating that throughout our organization? How are we rewarding wins? How are we compensating people appropriately for having success in this? How are we structuring the organization to support it? But that mindset really needs to start from the top and it needs to flow throughout everybody that's touching that business.
So that's interesting about mindset, which kind of leads me to another question. Where do suppliers tend to treat MSP work like regular staffing, right? So why does that create so much leakage? And I'm assuming mindset has something to do with that, but I'd be curious on your take.
Yeah, it's mindset and it's the willingness and commitment of the organization to devote resources to MSP business. It is different business, and I've said this before, I'm not for or against any staffing firm being in this space, but it is very hard to run traditional, retail-sized, contingent labor business off the same desk as you do MSP. So the workflows are different, and most suppliers, that are successful understand that. They will look at the ones that are getting this wrong or struggling with this. They might think about that same workflow through both of these kinds of business. They're prioritizing orders in the same way. They might have the same pacing for when submittals need to happen, and what feedback needs to look like on a submittal before they move forward. They might be incentivizing team members the exact same way, and it doesn't work. So MSP programs, relationship is critical, the strategy is critical, but at the order level, MSP programs reward speed and responsiveness and quality. And you need to understand at a program level where those things rank, right? So you could submit the best candidate ever on day 3, and somebody else might submit somebody maybe not even quite as qualified on day 1, but if that window has already closed by day 3, it doesn't matter. You're still not going to get that win. And so understanding the nuances of each of these programs and what their expectations are is important. Again, it's not all the same. It's not homogenous. It's not the same as your other retail business. MSPs really, that those programs are going to require a completely different execution model, and it's important for us to understand that and make sure that we have the right people aligned to it.
Right. So what you're describing too, it's the classic example of, you know, the organization works like this, this apple. And now all of a sudden you're introducing different techniques or different, issues that you have or different challenges. So you can't just be an apple, like you need to kind of broaden your spectrum. And it reminds me a little bit about that you had mentioned prioritization of the recs, and the challenge that I would have when I was carrying a book of business as far as orders often getting, in the MSP side, getting deprioritized because they feel like it's harder and it's less winnable, but meanwhile, it's negatively affecting your position. So what should suppliers be doing differently to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, and by the way, now I want apples and I'm hungry, so thanks
So
for
am I.
that analogy. Yeah, um, the MSP, I see this happen all the time. MSP orders get deprioritized because they are harder or they feel harder, and because they feel less personal, particularly if you're working with a customer that you used to have a lot of direct customer interaction with a hiring manager, and now you have less of that or none of that, and that can feel like a change in the personal relationship. Recruiters are going to naturally want to work the recs that feel winnable, and sometimes a direct rec is going to feel more winnable. But if no one owns MSP work from end to end, then it's always going to lose momentum internally. The distraction factor is real, and I might have a really great MSP order, but if I get a really great direct order or customer, then the whole mindset might shift. And so, having clear ownership of MSP business overall, which team members are going to be working that business, however you align them by client, by vertical, however you structure your business, but having that accountability and responsibility, setting the rules for what you want to have happen, what follow up needs to happen, and having the visibility to make sure that everybody understands here's what we're expecting, and aren't doing that at this point in time. It's really important that accountability is delineated between those 2 points of business. And as I said earlier, if this channel is important to your growth plan, then you need to be able to and be interested in and willing to commit resources to it. And if you're expecting it to grow just because you said so, the definition of insanity, it's not going to grow just because you've now stuck it on the desk of your best recruiter. In fact, you might end up hurting your non-MSP business rather than growing your MSP business. So it's really that accountability, and those expectations being set, and consequences, quite honestly, if this important work is deprioritized once you've decided it has a high importance strategically to the business.
Right. So then let me ask you, if you were to advise a supplier who wanted to genuinely win in MSPs, what are the few behaviors or habits you would insist on? You talked about accountability. But what else do you think is the secret sauce? Like, for example, would you split up your recruiting team to have, like, these are my dedicated MSP recruiters, so that's their lane, and they're gonna be 100% focused on it? If you could explain that a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, yes, and, resources are resources, and sometimes that becomes tricky, especially day 1, but yes, the best way to ensure that you're going to protect the business that you have that's retail and also commit to growing this business, I would have dedicated team members. Maybe it's not a whole separate division to start with. Maybe, you're not setting up an entirely new team. That can become quite daunting for a lot of staffing organizations, but having dedication within your organization, within your recruiters in particular, is absolutely something that I suggest. Um, as I said, deciding that that business matters, assigning that real ownership, tracking that business, particularly those leading indicators, not just fills, but all of the activities that lead up to those fills. Um, those are gonna be important things to make sure that you've got the right things in place for it to be successful, and those are the things that I advise suppliers on, in addition to many, many other things, having that dedication, visibility, and accountability.
That's fantastic. I think those are 3 great, takeaways. I think to kind of wrap up this section here, I'd like to ask you, what is the one thing suppliers think matters in MSPs that actually does not, and one thing they underestimate that really does?
So I'll start with the underestimate. They underestimate what they need to do with delivery, and I've said before, they treat it the same as the rest of their business, so they're underestimating, but the balance between speed and quality and follow through. Most of our MSP challenges are self-inflicted, and we've just kind of created our own challenge by not understanding, not just generally speaking, what it takes to be successful in MSP business, but the nuances between MSP programs and what they are expecting. Um, I think they overestimate the impact of, quite honestly, MSP fees or other things on their bottom line. They're not getting creative enough in thinking through, "How do I turn high volume revenue into solid profitability?" And they are overestimating the impact and, quite frankly, getting really grumpy about, a 2.5 or 3% MSP fee, when they have the ability to drive tremendous profitability to the bottom line if they think about this business differently.
Well, that's fantastic, Kelly. I think great, great points. And I think some of the key points that we take away from this episode is that MSP success is not luck. It's operating rhythm, it's enablement, and presence beyond the tool. So grateful for this knowledge. At the next episode, we're going to get to go back to SOW, but this time we're going to focus on the go-to-market strategy. We're going to talk a little bit about packaging, messaging, and how sellers learn to sell outcomes.